Case numbers in Singapore may be falling, but COVID-19 experts say this is no time to let your guard down.
For every new EP or S-Pass holder added in the last 5 years, about 4 more locals took up PMET jobs. Just think about that.
Today in Parliament, Manpower Minister Josephine Teo outlines how Singapore supports local PMETs and manages its foreign workforce.
Singapore's aerospace sector is getting more help to keep workers well trained and ready for when the recovery returns.
Good evening, you're watching The Big Story, coming to you live from the Straits Times newsroom. I'm Olivia Quay.
And I'm Haryanto Diman. You can subscribe to the Straits Times channel so you never miss a single episode.
Now, 40 new COVID-19 cases were confirmed today. There's one case in the community, a work pass holder.
There are also 7 imported cases, and all had been placed on stay-home notice upon their arrival in Singapore. More details will be released tonight.
Meanwhile, Straits Hot Pot, a restaurant in Havelock Road, was ordered to close from tomorrow to September 11th for flouting safe management measures. This included selling alcoholic beverages after 10:30 p.m.
The restaurant's staffs transferred these beverages into teapots and empty green tea bottles before serving them. To avoid detection, staff were also not wearing masks or not wearing them properly, as Straits was fined $2,000 for the offences.
Whimsical Bar in Science Park Drive is closed as well for similarly serving alcohol after 10:30 p.m. and allowing groups of more than 5 people to sit together. The bar was also operating without a food shop license and tables were placed less than a metre apart.
The adjacent unit, Create Kitchen, also violated similar measures and was ordered to close until September 11th. Both these businesses were fined $1,000 each. With citizens and establishments bending the rules, experts have said it's not too soon for people to let their guard down.
We're happy to welcome back Professor Tyoye Ying to the show. He's the Dean of the Swee Hock School of Public Health at the National University of Singapore. So, Prof. Teo, we can't expect most people to self-regulate and stick to the spirit of the guidelines. Do you think then that more rules should be implemented to cover any loopholes, like when we saw eateries no longer allowing groups of more than 5 people to sit together in light of, some people getting around that, the 5 persons rule?
Thank you for having me. So every country really have to experiment to find out what works and what doesn't. We can, of course, be absolutely strict and put in a lot more restrictions, including what you have mentioned about covering any loopholes in eateries, groups of more than 5 coming together. But whether these policies will be effective will still require individuals like you and me to follow the rules. If we keep thinking that I won't be so lucky to be infected, it won't happen to me, that's exactly when you introduce a crack in our community safety net, and the coronavirus will exploit this crack. So I don't think it's necessarily about putting in stricter rules, but more about letting everyone know that there is a consequence to irresponsible actions. And by the way, let me touch a little bit about the specific case you mentioned, when there are more than 5 people from different households coming together in a restaurant but on different tables. Yep. We have all heard about super spreading events, and this means just one single event that has the ability to cause many people to be infected. The reason why there is a strict rule regarding large groups eating together is because time and again we see such meal gatherings to be the reason why there is a big cluster of infections. The question really is, if we know this is the setting that leads to super spreading events, do we really still go ahead and allow large groups to eat together?
Right. Prof, with the Singapore Tourism Board encouraging us to rediscover Singapore, plus the upcoming handouts of the tourism credits, is this then mixed messaging, to go out, rediscover Singapore, but don't let your guard down?
Well, not at all. It is not mixed messaging at all. I think COVID-19 is going to stay with us for the next 12 to 18 months, likely till the end of 2021. And what that means is that we really have to learn to live with the virus in a way that allows us to lead lives as normal as possible, without significant risk to being infected and for the virus to spread in Singapore. A country that sees very little community cases But if the people are suffering because of widespread job losses, business failures, or that we are all getting a mental burnout because we keep worrying about the virus, our jobs, people can't go for holiday breaks, our lives will be rigid and miserable with all the things we cannot do. So this is not an indication of a country that is handling the virus well at all. But instead, if we now allow domestic tourism to resume, people will return to work, schooling to continue, and generally most of the things that many of us would normally be doing. And yet, our community cases remain low, remain manageable. I think that's a real indication Singapore is doing well to cope with the impact of the pandemic.
Prof, as we saw in South Korea, Australia and New Zealand, these countries have had to reimpose restrictions, and it seems like a resurgence is inevitable as we start to open up. So is it possible at all to achieve an ideal equilibrium of not running the risk of a flare-up in the community while still enjoying our daily life and reviving the economy at the same time?
So I think what we are trying to do now is exactly that. Letting lives return to normal for the most part while managing the risk of a resurgence in the community. We see that now there's some relaxation of our border control measures to Brunei and to New Zealand, two countries that have actually done very well in keeping their number of community infections low and quickly stamping out any flare-ups. And I think this has to be the same for Singapore, because we will see the occasional uptick in the number of community cases, even perhaps a large cluster emerging. But I think the measure of success here is really in the ability to stamp down these community cases and clusters without having to resort to a widespread lockdown. And I think as Singapore continues to lift more and more measures, especially around travel, I think we have to remember that the personal defenses, such as mask wearing, social distancing, personal hygiene, will continue to protect us as individuals. And I think we have done very well playing our part up to today to keep the numbers down. So I think let's keep doing that, and also to encourage our friends, families, and colleagues to do so as well.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Teo. We've been speaking to the Dean of the Swee Hock School of Public Health at NUS, Professor Tyoye Ying.
Also in the local headlines, essential travel between Brunei and Singapore will now be allowed, with arrangements by both countries to establish reciprocal green lane facilities at both ends. Applications open today, and travellers must observe some restrictions, including controlled itineraries, a negative COVID-19 test prior to the trip, and a swab test on arrival at their destination.
All workers staying in dormitories, as well as those who work in the construction, marine and process sectors and who visit work sites, must be tested for COVID-19 by this Saturday, September 5th. Only 8% of 1,500 employers have yet to log into the Health Promotion Board swab registration system, and so far, about 62,000 workers who need to be tested have yet to be scheduled. By September 5th, the workers must have started their rostered routine testing conducted every 14 days. Otherwise, they won't be able to return to work.
Singapore-listed Exinton announced the resignation of its non-independent, non-executive chairman, Evangeline Shen, who's also linked to the controversial Bellagraph Nova Group. 3 other Exinton directors also stepped down last night, and the reasons given for these resignations range from impending changes in the company's business to intense public scrutiny and health reasons. The departures come a week after former US Ambassador to Singapore, Kurt Wagger, resigned as an independent director.
Jobs, employability and wages all featured highly in today's debate in Parliament, with Manpower Minister Josephine Teo addressing the hot-button issue of work passes.
Now, she said imposing quotas on higher-end foreign professionals on employment passes is not unthinkable, but such a move would probably be unwise. Now, more importantly, Singapore should not miss the woods for the trees.
The number of locals in PMET jobs has grown on average around 35,000 annually. So we have the 9,000 in growth of EPs and S passes, average annual in the last 5 years, and during that same period, What is the growth of locals in PMET jobs? On average, 35,000 annually. For every new EP or S-Pass holder added in the last 5 years, about 4 more locals took up PMET jobs. Just think about that.
Mrs. Teo also announced that a new progressive wage model mark will be introduced to urge companies lift salaries for lower-income workers. She said the model could be expanded beyond the current sectors of cleaning, security and landscaping to include food, services and retail trade.
Now, the debate also highlighted issues younger workers are facing, while NTUC Assistant Secretary General Desmond Chu spoke about the need to give new graduates more help to improve their career prospects, while MP Tin Pei Ling stressed the importance of ensuring they have the right skills, behavior and attitude to become leaders.
This generation will require a career booster more so than other generations. Covid-19 will probably manifest a resilient generation, but they will need a helping hand to emerge stronger.
If we can find a way to cultivate a critical mass of Singaporean talents who not only are technically skilled, but also with leadership skills and acumen, the ecosystem will be so much healthier and competitive. Setting stricter quotas and higher minimum wages for employment passes are needed to address systemic vulnerabilities. But it is much more meaningful to have employers preferring to hire a Singaporean not just because they are obliged by our laws, but because they believe Singaporeans are worth the premium.
To further discuss today's Parliament proceedings, we're joined by Assistant News Editor Lim Yan Liang. Yan Liang, several proposals were laid out today to save jobs and uplift low-wage workers. From the Progress Singapore Party's approach to introduce quotas to making tweaks to the current system proposed by NTUC Deputy Secretary General Kopo Kun. Now, which ones stood out the most for you in terms of the feasibility in implementing the proposals?
So from today's discussion, as with yesterday's, it has largely centered on jobs. So I will perhaps focus on a couple of the ones that stood out for me. Mr. Leong Man Wai from the PSP was one of the first speakers today, and he championed foreign talent from an earlier age that was here to help Singaporeans eat other people's lunches rather than to come to eat our lunch. So he spoke about the possibility of instituting some form of a succession planning clause, where EP or S-Pass comes with a clause where at the end of at the expiration date, the foreign manager's job goes to a Singaporean. He also mentioned about how entry-level shops should be protected for Singaporeans. So the way that this can be done is for foreign PMETs to have a minimum work experience that's slightly longer before they're allowed to work in Singapore. For Mr. Kopo Kun, he championed extending the progressive wage model, which was discussed today as a minimum wage plus model, to more sectors rather than just today's cleaning, security and landscaping sectors. So he wants it to eventually become universal, and he mentioned how there are 2 sectors that are underway, where discussions are underway to introduce the PWM model too. The first being the lifts and escalators sector, which will institute this model by 2022, and that talks are also underway for the waste management sector to eventually get on board this model.
Right. Now, Manpower Minister Josephine Teo also spoke about a new progressive wage model mark. But Lian Yang, is that enough incentive for companies to voluntarily implement progressive wages and provide job advancement pathways, especially for the low-income workers?
So this PWM mark that Mrs. Teo brought up in her speech is meant for sectors that have not yet been required by the progressive wage model to offer progressive wages to their lower-income workers. So the intention here is for firms to voluntarily get on the progressive wage model and to offer their lower income workers progressive wages, a ladder of skills, if you may, for them to climb and then earn better wages. So she proposed that there are several sectors that can come on board, such as the food services and retail trade sectors. So in a way, this is in response to Mr. Kopo Kun's speech earlier, where he said that he would like for the progressive wage model to be universal in Singapore. So while we are not yet at that point, Mrs. Teo says that we can, by introducing the PWM mark, we can encourage more employers to proactively jump on the bandwagon. So whether this PWM mark succeeds depends on the broader movement of society at large. So what she said was that her hopes are that with the PWM mark, consumers will be more likely or be encouraged to patronize these firms or these companies because they have shown that they have good employment practices that are recognized by the government. Mrs. Teo also further on in her speech mentioned that companies that have been proactive in hiring locals, training their local staff, are recognized, and when it comes to EP applications, for instance, that they will be considered in a better light than employers that have not done so. Yeah.
You rightly mentioned earlier on as well that the discussions for these 2 days have largely centered on the employment and management of foreigners in Singapore. Now, with everything that's been said in Parliament, has Mrs. Teo been able to shed light on how the policies have been tweaked, especially in light of the COVID-19 pandemic?
Yes, I think Mrs. Teo used her quite lengthy speech today to go into how the manpower policies in Singapore have been tightened and enforcement measures stepped up in recent years. So for instance, she was able to share how the number of EP and S passes has actually come down very sharply, both in the last 5 years compared to the previous 5 years period and between January and July this year due to COVID-19. For instance, because of COVID-19, the number of EP and S pass holders has dropped by about 22,000 this year. So she also spoke about how the criteria for which EPs and S passes are granted has been tightened over the years. At the same time, the ministry has been doing proactive search and investigation of firms that they suspect of flouting employment practices or not fairly considering local workers. So in that case, in the respect, I think that she has shed some light, especially since the last 2 days of debate has centered around jobs and the management of foreigners in Singapore.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Yen Liang, for that sharing. Now, we were speaking to the Straits Times sister news editor, Lim Yen Liang.
As we know, COVID-19 has grounded airlines, halted travel and plunged the wider aerospace industry into crisis.
The sector employs more than 22,000 people in Singapore and is getting more support from the government in the form of training programs and fee subsidies. Now, multimedia journalist Charles Suen has more.
Not much use for equipment like this today, as the aerospace industry remains grounded by the COVID-19 pandemic. But those in the industry can access more training courses with more subsidies to help them remain relevant during this downtime. At a tour of the Singapore Aero Engine Services facility today, Trade and Industry Minister Chan Chun Sing and Minister of State for Manpower Gan Xiao Huang announced that more than 13,000 training places across about 100 courses will be made available to the sector. Workers in this training program will have their pay during this period, as well as their course fees, subsidized by up to 90%.
This is a very unique industry. It is not something that people can just easily join and then pick up the qualification and skills set in a short time. So this is an industry whereby we cannot take a short-term perspective to their investments, where we have a feast and famine strategy, whereby people just stop the training when there's no demand or suddenly surge the training when there's demand. These are not processes that can just be turned on and off. It requires time, it requires investment, it requires deep skill and knowledge in order for us to design the processes such that we can be ahead of our competitors.
The enhanced training support package essentially increases the funding support for the workers in the aerospace sector. This actually will give a lot of incentive for companies in the aerospace sector to upgrade and reskill the workers during this period. Now, we know that this is a crucial time, for our workers to be upskilled and also be positioned for recovery.
Many in the industry are fighting not just for survival, but to emerge stronger from the crisis.
Government has very quickly come up with support programs, as well as what's going to be announced today with regard to training. These have bought the industry time. Several trends have been accelerated by COVID, and this includes digital transformation, automation, and so on. And we're using this time not only to retain current capabilities, but also to prepare for that future.
With the aerospace industry not likely to take off until 2024, keeping their skills and engines polished has become the priority of many in the industry, anticipating the day that they can take to the skies the moment the storm clears. Chao Suen for the Straits Times.
Dylan Ang here with the global headlines. Malaysia reported a new COVID-19 cluster in Port Dickson involving crew members on a ship that had travelled from Singapore. Health authorities tested all 34 members and have confirmed 4 cases as of this morning. 6 tested negative, while the results of the remaining 24 are pending. Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte announced the extension of partial restrictions in and around Manila until the end of the month. This to tackle a rising number of coronavirus cases and further expand hospital capacity. Hong Kong launched a voluntary mass coronavirus testing scheme today as part of efforts to stamp out a third wave of infections that began in late June. But the program has been hampered by a limited response due to the involvement of mainland Chinese testing firms and doctors, as well as swirling public fears of the harvesting of data and DNA as Beijing cracks down on calls for democratic reform. Only 510,000 people have signed up since registration began on Saturday, around 7% of the total population. Australia yesterday confirmed the detaining of journalist Cheng Lei in China as relations between the two nations worsen over trade and security concerns. Ms. Cheng is a journalist and television anchor working for the Chinese government's English news channel, CGTN. Australian authorities said they have not been told the reason behind the detaining. Former Indian President Pranab Mukherjee, who had tested positive for COVID-19 earlier this month, died yesterday at the age of 84. He died of multiple organ failure after being admitted to hospital weeks ago, having also tested positive for the coronavirus. And flying deliveries, Amazon received approval from the Federal Aviation Administration for drone deliveries in the US. The milestone will now allow the company to operate its fleet of prime air delivery drones, which aim to drop off packages below 2.26 kilograms at doorstops in 30 minutes or less in areas with a low population density. And those are the headlines from around the world. It's back to you guys in the studio.
Thanks so much, Dylan. Well, those are our top stories for today. For more news and videos, visit straitstimes.com and subscribe to our YouTube channel by hitting the red button below.
Once again, I'm Haryanto Diman with Olivia Quay. Join us tomorrow for more stories on A Big Story.